My name is James Trimmer. I'm Director of Planning and Environment at the Port of London Authority. We first undertook a climate change adaptation report, as we were required to do by government following the Climate Change Act, and this was the first time that the organisation had considered the effects of climate change both on our operations and the operations of the port as a whole. And from it we considered a range of issues that might be affected by climate change. Of course, business continuity is one, but generally for our own operations. And what we thought to begin with was that flood tides, surge tides coming in from the North Sea up to London would be the big issue with climate change, and therefore it would be sea level rise that would be the most telling impact on the port for 30-40 year horizon that we were looking at. And actually what we found from the report when we'd considered a risk assessment and the climate change predictions and the resulting weather was that upstream, so in the upper reaches of the tidal river, there'd be more impact, and that was particularly from higher fluvial flows in the winter and lower fluvial flows in the summer, and therefore the impacts on navigation from either too much water in the river in the winter or too little in the summer. And that was actually surprising for us. We didn't imagine that that type of impact would actually come out of the report, because we were always focused at the deep end of the river and thought that sea level rise would be the big issue. And actually what we now believed from this report was that it would be fluvial flow, so rainfall. Well, we'd completed the report, the climate change adaptation report, as I say, as we were required to do by government, and submitted it. And it had come back that it was acceptable. And then the following winter, which was after a period of drought, it didn't stop raining. And I think this was 2011, 2012, I think. And we had months consistently of very, very high fluvial flow coming into the tidal reaches of the river. So it was only a short time after we'd submitted the report where we thought on a long term, so on a climate timescale, this might happen. There might be an issue with too much rainfall. A year later, it actually happened. And so we were faced with the challenge of how to adapt to an effect that we were imagining was only going to happen in the much longer term. And it was something that, although we had signalled in the report that we would consider and monitor and of course consider adaptation approaches, it actually happened. So whilst the report considered that something would happen, we hadn't actually come up with an adaptation that we could cope with in a large period of time for months on end. Navigation in rowing boats particularly, there's an awful lot of rowing upstream of Putney and the upper reaches, that navigation for unpowered craft would be dangerous because of effectively this very, very high fluvial flow. So we had to work very quickly in the context of the risk assessment that we'd undertaken for the climate change report to come up with a mitigation, which in the end was a series of signals to those rowing, particularly affected by very fast currents that we were getting, whether they should actually go out on the water or not. So we have flags now which indicate how much the fluvial flow is, and they're flown both from our craft as they manoeuvre on the river and at a number of points up and down the river and at the rowing clubs as well. So we had to work with the rowers, the affected parties, to actually come up with an idea of when we knew that these dangerous conditions would be. and that rowers should not enter the river, particularly if they were novice rowers, because of the climate change effect that, although we thought was coming, happened very, very suddenly. And so we ended up coming up with an adaptation technique on the hoof, because we didn't think it was going to come that quickly. You know, we were thinking we'd have 20 years, and instead we had 1 year. The first stage was, or the first report was compulsory, and it was for all ports handling over 10 million tonnes of cargo. So there was a number of ports that had to prepare a report. We are slightly different because other ports handle cargo as well. We don't. We're effectively a navigation authority. A number of the issues we looked at were those relating to navigation, so our duties as a whole. So we prepared that as we had to do, submitted it. And then there was a second round, which we submitted a report earlier this year, which was voluntary. And therefore, a number of the ports submitted a further report, which was stages undertaken, anything that had changed. But a number of the ports who had submitted in the first round didn't, and said that nothing had changed, and therefore they weren't going to submit a further report. We did, again, primarily on the, as I've explained, on the circumstances of the fluvial flow and the winter floods that we had for several months. And that was effectively the report, how we adapted and how it's moved on from there. I think if we look at, again, this navigation issue, just I keep coming back to it because obviously this is, you know, we've had practical experience now. That was a new approach. I mean, some flags perhaps isn't infrastructure in its sense, but a lot of the mitigation measures we looked at were related to communication as much as anything. It's all well and good having new infrastructure, but a lot of the impacts that we see on climate change will be on users of the river. And therefore, unless we communicate and work with them so that they understand what the impacts will be and how they have to deal with it, and say that the flag's been a good example because they didn't know, you know, we had to explain to them and work with them that actually if the red flag was showing and it was unsafe to go in the water, although we couldn't stop them, it would be for their own good. And so in that case, communication was paramount, and it was some new infrastructure, but communication around it. We're also now looking for new works that we undertake, new radars, new navigation aids, which is again another of our duties. Ensuring that the power supplies and the structures themselves can withstand the likely sea level rise that's being predicted for the next 50 years. So they are being raised and the power supplies are being isolated and flood-proof, effectively. So we are now looking at both modifying existing kit we have out there, and when we order new equipment, ensuring that it's either positioned in a place where it shouldn't be flooded, or ensuring it can be isolated and therefore it won't flood and damage the equipment. There was a degree of cynicism when we had to start looking at climate change. We thought this is something that would happen decades away, and that has proved to be wrong. We also thought as well that, as I said, it would be something for one part of the river and nothing else would be affected. And in the end, through the risk assessment and through real life, we found out actually we were completely wrong on that as well. So to be wrong with two assumptions, you sort of think actually the process itself was worthwhile, because when we had the winter rains, that it is understood that it was a freak occurrence and therefore could be ascribed to climate change. We were readier, I think, for it and for dealing with how we adapt to it than had we not looked at anything before. If we'd just we'd undertaken no risk assessments, we hadn't thought about any of the effects, then when this happened, I think we'd probably have been more paralysed and wondering what was going on than we actually had a report and we understood to an extent that the likely effects of climate change would be in terms of rainfall and the implications it would have. So actually we were better prepared, I think, than had we not even considered it. And I think as well it changed people's views. In any organisation there are those who believe climate change is man-made and of course is happening, and those who perhaps don't. And I think the report that we did and the years worth of internal work raised the consciousness and the awareness of people in the organisation that actually is something we did have to think about. Even if it was a long way away, we had to think about it. The fact that it happened pretty soon after was something else, but we actually did have to think about it as an issue for what we do and that things might change. I think the first thing to do is to think about it, because it is a long-term issue normally, and therefore with everything else that's happening on a day-to-day and even a strategic timescale, things like climate change tend to be left to the side. It's something we'll look at later, and I think that's something that it's natural because the day-to-day issues take up more time. But it's something that does have to be grasped because the events that may well be triggered by climate change can happen at any time, as we found out. So I think looking at it is one thing. The second piece of advice is that the assumptions that you might have about what would happen need to be challenged. As I say, we thought that there'd be one set of issues and assumptions, and in the end, they weren't right. And therefore coming with a fixed mindset that climate change will result in X is not the way of looking at it. It has to be an open mind. And I think the third thing I'd say is we looked at it from all disciplines of the organisation, from those involved in finance, from the harbour masters, from hydrographic surveying in terms of the monitoring as to what sea level rise is. There that we've got charts and data going back decades, so they have a part to play. Engineering, navigation systems, everyone came in and was part of the risk assessment. It was a lot of organisation to do, but that provided the space to challenge everyone's assumptions and actually come up with a better piece of work. So don't just give it to, in our case, the Environment Department and say that they'll get on with it, because the impact's on all parts of the organisation, so everyone's got to look at it.